I'm the Executive Director of Australian Owner Manager, and welcome to this webinar series that we've put together for business owners during this what's a challenging time for all of us. So Australian Owner Manager is a boutique education and development company. We deliver practical education mainly focused around the owners of mid-sized companies. We grew out of work from the University of Queensland Business School and the Ice House in New Zealand, which is often recognised as Australasia's leading business accelerator. So today's webinar is focused on employment rules and regulations in the current COVID-19 pandemic. We're very pleased to be joined today by the team at Mapien. They're an employment strategy and national industrial relations firm. They've got offices in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, and I often describe them as Australia's best kept secret in this employment and industrial relations space. So I'm going to hand you over to Nadia Taylor, who's one of the directors of Mapien, who will facilitate the webinar from here.
Thanks, Rob. At Mapien, we're really delighted to be a partner of Owner Manager as part of their HR advisors. Mapien are workplace strategists, and we work with employers to navigate the difficult issues of people at work. As an Owner Manager run business ourselves, we really understand the particular unique circumstance that exists for people in Owner Manager run businesses. But we also work with many other organisations, from corporates to small businesses to the for-purpose sector. A key, philosophy behind our business is that we take a multidisciplinary approach to helping employers solve problems in the workplace. We engage organisational psychology, behavioural insight, specialist human resource strategy and thinking, as well as employment law and industrial relations, to come up with a holistic solution that fits particular workplaces. So for today's session, we've assembled an 18 panel from our business to really give you that multidisciplinary insight into how you can survive this difficult period we're going through and hopefully come through to thrive at the other end. So with me from the panel today, we have Jason Wessel, who is an organisational psychologist with Mapien, works very much in the leadership, behavioural insights and culture space. We also have Belinda Honey, who is another director of the business. Belinda has extensive experience in employee relations, but also strategic human resources issues, and works with very large corporates as well as owner manager businesses across the nation. And lastly, we have our in-house employment law expert, Alex Aspromorgas, also the chairman of Mapien, who is going to answer some of the really specific industrial relations issues that people are asking about. And Belinda, as an advisor to many employers, and obviously as a business owner yourself, what are the key things that employers should be thinking about immediately to address the situation that we have before us?
Thanks. Thanks, Nadia. Well, we've obviously had to look at this issue ourselves in our own business, and I think it's driving a lot of the conversations that we're now having with our clients as well. There's three key areas that we're focused on at the moment. The first one is very much around health and safety and well-being of the staff. So it's about making sure that people are working within a safe environment, that you're doing everything to ensure that they remain healthy, whether that's working from home or whatever other options there are in terms of trying to ensure that healthy and safe working practices are happening for those who are still remaining in a workplace. So very much focused on that. And I think that's what staff expect. They expect us to be very focused on that issue and to be acknowledging our contribution in terms of the wider society as well, that it's really important we focus on that. The next thing, obviously, is the immediate response. You know, we've been impacted by it ourselves, as are every company that we've spoken to. That immediate impact of work not happening, people not being able to be in the workplace, making sure that you're communicating with staff, getting some strategies in place for how you're going to manage some of the complex issues around not having work for people, having less work for people, all of those types of issues. And Alex will talk about that a lot more as well. And then the last one is focusing on the future. At the end of the day, it's important that, you know, we all acknowledge we're going to get through this. We don't know how long it's going to be. Employees are feeling very uncertain at the moment. Is it going to go for a month? Is it going to go for 2 months, 6 months? At the moment, we're all hoping it'll go at the shorter end, but it's giving people some hope. And very much focusing on the future. So a lot of it's around the cultural issues, around making sure you're keeping your workforce connected, that you're continuing to engage with your employees. So I think they're probably the summary of the main 3 areas we can look at.
Thanks, Belinda. We'll endeavour throughout today's session to drill down in some more detail into those 3 areas, because I agree that the risks, what do you do with your staff in the interim, and that's your culture and connection. How can we keep that maintained? I guess just a combination of the first and last ones, just turning to Jason. Jason, I think people are already very quickly realising that for those of us who are lucky enough to still be working, that the new world in terms of how we work, with most people working from home now, obviously some businesses are continuing to operate face-to-face, but for those that are working from home or in different environments, I guess, to what they're used to, what are the key risks that you see facing employers, particularly from that wellbeing perspective that we're all starting to, I guess, be conscious of now?
Yeah, great question. There are actually so many. Ultimately, this is going to expose a lot of cracks in not just people's coping, but in organizational lines of communication and support. And without getting too technical about it, depending on your industry, 6 of the 7 biggest workplace stresses are going through the roof right now. That means without appropriate counterbalancing with supports, you're likely to see falls in productivity, more conflict, poor decisions, and in the long term, if you're still operational, high rates of stress and burnout. Clients are already talking to us about people taking sick leave just to relieve some of the stress, and even some concerns about people putting in work cover claims for stress in certain states. That seems to be more popular than others. But worse than that is, with so many people working from home now, rates of domestic violence are spiking all over the world. In Australia, services are expecting cases to triple. But many of those services are also closing face-to-face support. So the impact of domestic violence on people's work and their lives is going to compound over this period. And, you know, while they're working with you, I suppose in their place of work, they're not safe. And that's going to be a really confronting challenge for a lot of leaders. And it's not even to mention risks to financial hardship, with people being stood down, asked to take a cut in hours or wages, and the flow-on effects of that. Recently, a really well-renowned global epidemiologist came out against the tide and challenged whether the unintended risks to well-being were worth the drastic measures to slow the spread of coronavirus. He was really quickly shot down by his peers, but you know, he makes a good point. We don't know how far and wide the damage of these measures will be to people's well-being. This is truly unprecedented times.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's pretty scary, isn't it, Jason? And obviously, particularly I think as owner managers, when we work in our business, we really want to take care of our people. They're very often we consider them part of our family. And we've got to make these difficult decisions to ensure that the business continues to hopefully be sustainable enough to survive to the end of this period, but knowing that it's going to have such an incredible impact on our people. So we will try to drill down into some of those areas, particularly around how to address things like conflict and those sort of issues. Before we do, Jason, do you have any, I guess, high-level recommendations for employers out there about how to try and manage those risks that you just mentioned?
Yeah, like on a low level, there's a lot you can do, but on a high level, you have to be proactive. You won't have as much visibility of what's going on in your organizations right now, and you have to keep your finger on the pulse, actively looking for things that you can do differently to counterbalance mounting pressures. I mentioned 6 of the 7 workplace stresses are going through the roof right now. There are also 7 key supports. If you know which individual sectors, stresses are particularly bad in your organization, that gives you an idea of what you can do to try and manage and reduce the impact on people. And similarly, if you know what supports or resources your people are lowest on right now, it gives you an idea of what you can try to help them. Basically, it lets you focus on what you can do most effectively, where you can most effectively place your effort to support them, because you can't focus on everything right now. That's not a good use of your resources. So, you know, we do have a tool that can help take the pulse of where those stressors and which one of them are high and low in your organization. But we've also recently put together an FAQ, which we can circulate. I wish there was, beyond being proactive and keeping your finger on the pulse, I wish there was a more high level, but ultimately the industry pressures are so different right now. The individual team level pressures are so different right now. For us, it's just about giving people really digestible bites of information that they can make sure they're taking the right approaches, bespoke and tailored for their own internal issues and pressures. So we can support, but again, summarize, high level, be proactive, don't rest on your assumptions that you know what's going on. Don't, and it's going to change daily. The best thing you can do is check in frequently and ask people how they're going.
Thanks, Jason. You make a really good point there in terms of, I guess, when people are in front of us, it's easier to get a sense of how they're going in terms of their well-being and productivity and engagement and all those things. So I guess that's why you've come up with this way to at least take a temperature test to see how people are going when they're not in front of you.
Yeah, particularly now, leaders, they've got the massive problems in front of them, and taking on this extra layer of connectivity and check-in, it's complicated in the best of times. Right now, it's really, really challenging. So yeah, we're really trying to support people, you know, overcome that challenge and adapt to it.
We've just had a question come through from one of the participants. You mentioned the 7 workplace stresses, and you said 6 out of 7 of them high. Can you just talk to that quickly, what those stresses are?
Sure. So high level, uncertainty about the future. Uncertainty is a huge one. It's one that you brought up right at the outset of this. Not being able to bank on anything happening in the short, near or far term is a huge stressor to people. And that's something that we can measure, but it's also something that we can proactively work towards reducing. And from a leader perspective, this is when we start getting into the weeds, but some leaders feel like they need to know the answers to be able to reduce that uncertainty. And you don't. You can reduce uncertainty just by saying, we don't know. This is a moving feast. We're meeting daily. We're going to provide updates weekly at 12 p.m. on a Friday or a Monday morning. And that's still a level of certainty that people can grab onto. It doesn't remove or erase uncertainty, but it reduces it. And this is what's going to get you through this time, is looking for those things that you can claw back a little bit of. So if you have an idea that uncertainty is one of those 7 stresses, that's something that you need to invest effort and time in. But at the same time, some organizations are knocking down that amount and doing that exceptionally well. So that might not be an issue in your organization. Ambiguities of current work and how you're getting through today is another one of the stresses. So an organization that might be doing well with reducing uncertainty might not be doing so well on telling people and supporting people to nail today's work. So that's another thing that you can do a pulse, figure out, get the boundaries of how clear people are on what their work is on a day-to-day basis. And if that's something that's flagging for your organization, that's something that you can invest time and effort into, trying to increase certainty about day-to-day and how to actually do the job. So those are the kind of the 2 biggest ones right now, I think, but that's a very general approach. Different industries and organizations have different ones right now. And then within that, different organizations have different ones. The pace and amount of work, there's, I think, 3 key changes right now. You've got the industries and the organizations on the essential service supply line that are just getting smashed with pace and amount of work right now. You've got others that are BAU but working from home and in different challenges. So that might not be something that you focus on as a demand or a stressor right now, if that's you. And you have got other industries that the work's just evaporated. So the pace and amount of work is not really something that you should invest time and effort in unless you need to increase a bit of pace and amount of work. I'll summarize the other ones: mental load, emotional load, change in tasks. We're all going through a lot of all those three things right now, more and less in different organizations and industries. The one of the 7 that I said is probably not the biggest that's going through the roof right now is physical demands of your job. Obviously, some industries are much more physical than others. I think broadly speaking, high level across the board, there's not a great deal of changes into the physical efforts, but that's just surface level. There's still physical changes in your working from home, arrangements with repetitive strain and not having the right work-home setups. And then there are organizations like supply chain warehouses that might have increased physical efforts, particularly when it comes to doing a rapid amount of work, and they start dropping the ball on the safety side of things just to meet the demand and get through, and everyone's kind of doing 110% right now. So I said 6 of the 7 are going through the roof, but that's not to say that the 7th isn't as important in certain pockets.
Thanks, Jason. I think that gives everyone really more detailed understanding of the types of stresses and how different responses that you can take to them. And also, obviously, the clear message I take from you is that it depends on your organisation and where you're at. That FAQ you mentioned, so for our participants, we will be distributing after this session an FAQ on the organisational psychology and leadership and culture type issues, and also one in relation to the industrial relations issues. Obviously, we're about to go into the detail of the employers' options and the obligations that they have from an industrial perspective. Before we do, given that at Mapien, we really take a multidisciplinary approach, as I said, and it's not just about the legal answer. As an experienced industrial relations practitioner, is there anything you want to say in terms of context for employers when they're making decisions about the legal options in front of them that are important to think about when you make those choices as an employer?
Thanks, Nadia. Certainly, and this is not necessarily a legal answer, it's more a kind of practical answer, is that there's lots of challenges from a legal and structural industrial framework at the moment, because our system has never really contemplated the sort of unprecedented crisis that we are currently facing as a country and as a society. And I think the one thing that is most important is the continual communication, not just with your employees, but all of your various stakeholders in your business. And I think that getting the employees to understand where your business is placed, the challenges that it's facing that may appear currently to be insurmountable, but it's a shared challenge. It's not a challenge that we as managers can kind of address in isolation. We need to have our employees coming along with us and supporting us in the endeavours that we're putting in place to make our businesses survive the next period of time and the uncertainty associated, whether that's 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 12 weeks. No one knows. No one has those answers currently. So it's really about getting the employees aligned with the goals that we're seeking at the moment.
Sounds like good advice, Alex, and that would come down to communication. And I guess unprecedented seems to be the word of 2020, other than COVID-19. And I guess that refers back to the point that Jason made before, that it's okay to say that you don't know at this stage. What you do have to do is provide them with as much certainty as possible in those communications. So that makes sense from an industrial perspective too. Okay, so let's turn to those specific questions that every employer is asking our business right now. And one of the most common other words we're hearing a lot is stand down. So that most businesses would not have experienced a situation before where they've had to consider that type of response. Can you explain, Alex, what is a stand down, and when should employers be looking to use that arrangement?
Yeah, I mean, a stand down is a particular arrangement which is permitted by the Fair Work Act, which essentially allows an employer to stand down employees without pay if a stoppage of work occurs for a reason which is beyond the control or responsibility of the employer. The textbook examples around stand down is normally, breakdown of machinery, a problem in a supply chain, a cyclone has kind of closed businesses, floods, fires. They're your textbook stand down scenarios, but certainly COVID-19 in its broadest kind of context, but in particular having regard to specific responses taken by governments to control the spread of the infection, are providing triggers for businesses to stand down employees without pay. This is not to say that every single business in Australia can stand down their employees. You have to look at the particular situations and circumstances. Some are more obvious than others. So, working in hospitality, in restaurants, in events, catering, the current kind of bans on those activities are an obvious stand down trigger. For other employers working in retail or wholesale, in those sorts of areas, there's a significant downturn in business, but it's a bit more challenging sometimes to draw the connection to be sufficient to be a trigger for stand down.
And is it possible to stand down parts of your business as opposed to the whole business at once?
Yeah, it is. And we often confuse stand down with shutdown. Now, sometimes they go hand in hand. So if you shut down the entirety of your operations, then you don't have a capacity to employ people, and therefore there's an opportunity to stand down. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to shut down the entirety of your operation. So again, kind of, using a fairly obvious example, a stadium. Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane, no longer allowed to have the Broncos play there. So all of the event day staff can be stood down without pay, but there's still a capacity to usefully employ some employees behind the scenes to maintain the fields, to clean what is required to be cleaned, to do maintenance and those sorts of things. So just because a significant number of employees are required to be stood down doesn't necessarily mean that all do. And in fact, there's a positive obligation under the Act to identify whether employees can be usefully employed or not. And usefully employed is a determination made by the employer. So, in past less serious scenarios, I've had unions come and say, well, you can't stand down those employees because they could be raking the gardens or painting the rocks or doing an inane, unnecessary task. An activity is not usefully employed. Usefully employed means there are roles and functions which an employer needs to be undertaken to continue business.
Okay. And in that situation where you've got some employees you're standing down and some you're not, and maybe they usually have the same job, how do you pick which ones you stand down and which ones you give the other work to?
With a very heavy heart. It's a very, very difficult decision. And having these discussions with owner managers on a day-to-day basis is really, it's really quite difficult. You can't play favourites. You have to treat everyone the same, but you can't help but feel for the clients.
Alex, I know you've been heavily involved in supporting some of our clients who have massive operations and are standing down thousands of employees at the moment, so we understand. Belinda, I might turn to you now, just to give Alex a moment. In terms of selecting employees in these situations, can you give any other guidance as to what might be fair selection criteria?
Sorry, Nadia, I was on mute. Look, I think that, you know, we all acknowledge the stress in this situation, and Alex has seriously been right on the front line dealing with some very difficult situations. So the situation in terms of selecting staff, at the end of the day, you need to look at who has the skills, who has the capability to be able to continue the work that has to be done. It needs to be a fair process in that you have to make sure that you know, you're not picking someone because they're the manager's favourite or something like that. You do need to have some criteria around you know, making sure that you're looking specifically at what skills they have, what experience they have. You know, you might even start to look at some things like, have they been with the business for a long period of time and things like that. But it's just trying to make sure that the employees can see that there's a fair process. Look, I think the reality is this is a very stressful process for everybody. And I know we deal with a lot of smaller, medium and very large businesses. And the thing that's becoming clear at the moment is people are just in shock. And you know, we're getting asked on a daily basis, you know, employers are saying, well, you should be paying out my annual leave. You know, if you're going to stand me down for a couple of weeks, you need to be paying me my annual leave. The stand down principles don't necessarily enable you to do that. It require you to do that. Stand down is about a period of time where there's no work. And if you can give people annual leave, because you can afford to give people annual leave, then that's okay. But if you can't, then that's what the stand down principles are there for. Someone just asked a quick question. Sorry, Nadia, I saw it pop up on my screen.
Yes.
About last on, first off. No, I'm not necessarily supporting last on, first off, but what I'm saying is you need to look at a variety of different aspects. I mean, you know, if you've got someone who really understands your business because they've been in that business for a long period of time and can quickly answer questions and quickly find solutions and things like that, then they may be the person who's most who's best to select to not stand down and to continue working. It's a complex issue. You just have to look at all the variables, but try and make it look as and make it as fair as possible.
Thanks, Belinda. And it makes sense, obviously, because in the situation with a stand down, generally speaking, employers don't have the cash to pay out accrued leave entitlements. So the ability to stand down without having to pay leave is going to be critical for survival of employers. I guess one question that I've seen coming up, and I've missed to either Alex or to Belinda, what if you're looking at a situation where you have some work available, and you're looking to stand, one option is to stand people down, but you have some work. Can you turn to your full-time employees and say, look, I've got enough work for everyone if you all go part-time, but if you don't, you know, I'll have to stand some of you down. Like, can you make people go part-time in this situation?
That's a question that's in a state of flux. So late yesterday afternoon, the Fair Work Commission made an amendment to the hospitality award, which now allows employers to effectively reduce the hours of full-time and part-time employees by 40%. So that's an unusual scenario. We've never seen a clause like that in an award previously, but I'm expecting that will start to flow through to a number of industry-based awards. So in that scenario, yes, you could direct a reduction across the board to up to 40%. In the circumstances before that, which is facing most other employers, you can't force someone to go part-time. But what you can do is you can put the options up to them. And the options are, we're considering leave without pay across the board unless we can get people to agree as a collective to this outcome. Or alternatively, you can say, we are standing everyone down and it's leave without pay, but we are making these part-time hours available for those that wish to perform that work. If everyone performs, it's the same outcome. If only half of them perform, it may be better for those that remain because they will have more hours available, assuming that you can spread the hours equally.
And in terms of the status of an employee when they are stood down, are they still employed, and are there any entitlements that do apply during that period?
Stand down is without pay. They're still employed. So it doesn't trigger redundancy, and I've seen a number of questions like that come through. So if you stand down employees, it does not trigger redundancy, and in fact, in the current climate, that's exactly why people are being stood down, because there is no money available for redundancies. Now, the period that this stand down can continue, again, we use the unprecedented word, they don't normally extend for more than 2, 3, 4 weeks. This could extend for months and months. And at some point in time, some of the employers and businesses that have stood down employees will make the difficult decision to shut. At that point, a redundancy is triggered, but until that decision is made, and presumably that won't be until the COVID-19 crisis is largely resolved, there is no redundancy trigger. And that's important because, large-scale redundancies could force many employers to the wall. So stand down is a way to avoid that additional financial burden.
Nadia, if I could just add something following on from that, the issue of stand down, that the employees are still in effect employed, it doesn't necessarily prevent them in terms of Centrelink and things like that. And a number of employers that we've been working with have actually given a letter to the employees advising them of the situation, and then the employees have then gone to Centrelink. So even though they're still employed, they're going through a period of no pay. So, I haven't spoken to Centrelink about this, but I know a number of our clients have been writing letters to enable the employees to take it to Centrelink.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Belinda. I think a lot of employers are looking at how different options they apply might affect Centrelink payments, and well, we're not advisors in that area. Certainly the accountants we work with have advised that they do have access to those benefits as if they had been laid off rather than were stood down. So as opposed to if they were receiving paid leave during the period. There's a question here in terms of what if employees then quit during the stand down period? Is there any change? Is that just a basic resignation, or are they entitled to redundancy at that point?
No, if they resign, there's no capacity for an employer to stop that. The only reason why an employee practically would resign during this period would be to get access to their accrued leave entitlements if the leave entitlements were not made available to them. So some employers are facing disastrous financial consequences. They can't afford to pay leave. They'd love to be able to pay employees their accrued leave during this period, but they don't have the money to do so. So they're holding that back. Once an employee resigns and a termination is triggered, then a payment would be required to be made. Now, if any of the participants online today are in that situation, if someone resigns, they're required to give you notice. So you could drag it out to the end of the notice period, either in the award or the contract, before you would have to trigger that payment. But that would be the legal obligation then.
And obviously in that situation, Alex, if they're stood down, you're not actually paying them during that notice period, are you?
No, that's right. They're not being paid. No.
Yeah. And is it correct that during the stand down period, leave accrues, and is superannuation treated differently in any way?
There is a provision in the Fair Work Act which allows for leave accrued under the Fair Work Act to continue during a period of stand down. So the most obvious ones there would be annual leave and personal leave. That doesn't extend to long service leave, because long service leave is governed by state legislation and it differs from state to state. Now, I can't give the answer for every state, but I know I've looked in Queensland and Victoria, and in both of those states, it doesn't accrue. So long service leave does not accrue during the period of the stand down.
Thank you. And so once we get to hopefully this end of the period, everyone keeps saying the bridge to the other side. Once we reach that point and you're looking at your needs, and Alex, you kind of referred before to, you know, at that point you might decide whether there's a redundancy or not at the end, whether if you can't bring them back. Is there any sort of rule around who you bring back, and is a redundancy triggered at that point or do you have to offer them their job back first? Are there any obligations around that?
It's a brave new world. No one's really faced this kind of long-term stand down, so there's no rules. We make up the rules as we go, but the organisation that we were pre-COVID-19 and the organisation that we will be post-COVID-19 is likely to be radically different. So people will need to determine, or organisations will need to determine who are the right employees that they need in the business moving forward to make it successful in whatever form that it takes. And that would be no different to any sort of major restructuring decision where you look at skill, you look at fit, and you select the most appropriate persons who will allow the organisation to succeed.
And as an example of that, one of our participants has asked about, I guess, the selection criteria of casuals versus full-time. Is there any obligation to treat full-time employees preferentially to casuals, for example?
In a return to work scenario?
Yes.
It would make sense to do it. I mean, it would depend on what the roles were, but if you didn't re-engage a full-timer at that point, that would trigger redundancy payments, and that would have obviously a commercial impact. The decision not to re-engage a casual employee will not have a particular financial impact in that regard. So it's really about appropriate skill mix, and you may still need a mix of full-time, part-time and casual employees in the organisation in its new structure.
So, one question, Alex, can you force people to take annual leave or long service leave instead of, say, a shutdown or redundancy?
No, you can't force them, but you can put them in a position where it is a much better option than the alternative. So you basically say, we'll need to stand you down without pay unless you wish to avail yourself of your accrued annual leave or long service leave. If they choose not to, then they'll leave without pay.
And I think, does that depend on, sometimes you see in agreements there is an ability to direct people to take leave. Would that be an exception to that?
Yeah, because we're not directing, we're getting their agreement. We're just putting a context where agreement seems to be the obvious outcome. There are some industrial instruments that allow for the taking of annual leave on short periods of notice, but generally awards of 4 weeks. But the hospitality award, which I mentioned earlier, was amended yesterday, now allows for that to occur on 24 hours notice. So that's the only award that currently has that sort of very narrow time frame.
Okay, and 2 more questions. You did discuss stand down, and you mentioned that employees would still accrue their leave entitlements during that period. Is it possible to ask employees to take leave without pay, which obviously doesn't accrue those entitlements?
No, it's the same. In that period, if you're stood down, then you would accrue. If you go to someone and say, oh, we're thinking about what to do, are you prepared to take leave without pay voluntarily? Well, then technically, yes, it would not accrue, but it is very much splitting hairs. And I think it probably will come back to bite someone culturally later on, and fairness and values of the organisation.
Questions around self-isolation, which is coming up quite a lot. What do you do in a situation if an employee does need to self-isolate? Are they entitled to sick leave? Does it depend on whether they're sick or whether they are self-isolating because they were on one of the beleaguered ships we have? What's the situation there?
Yeah, it really depends on what the trigger point for self-isolation is. If I have COVID-19, then clearly I would be able to access personal leave, assuming I have personal leave accruals available. If I've been required to self-isolate because I've returned from overseas, I've had contact with someone that has COVID-19, I don't have a illness or an injury which would trigger an entitlement to paid personal leave. Now, that being said, many organisations are still providing paid personal leave in that situation because the trigger for self-isolation is coming directly from a health directive or it's a directive. It was previously recommendation, but now a health directive to self-isolate. So most employers I deal with are paying it, and it's still relatively small numbers. So it's not been a significant cost impost thus far.
And what about the scenario of people who are, I guess, being called vulnerable people, where they're over a certain age group or they have immune systems that are in significant danger? How do we deal with them? I guess one scenario that your businesses continue to operate as normal. Do you need to continue to provide them with work or not? And also, what if, like, working from home, the various scenarios people are facing?
Yeah, those vulnerable groups, and I kind of fall into two categories. Those that really are identified as being vulnerable because of their age, because of their medical history, because of a variety of other factors. That's a workplace health and safety situation. So like any other risk in a workplace, that needs to be managed. An example, in Queensland at the moment, Education Queensland have indicated that no teacher over the age of 60 will be working in the schools because they're identified as a more vulnerable person and therefore more exposed in a circumstance where there is lots of social interaction despite the social distancing rules and hand hygiene rules that have been put in place within that organisation. You then have another category of employee that are panicked and fearful. They're not at higher risk, but they have a fear of contracting COVID-19 and want to, not interact with people and a workplace. That needs to be managed because those fears are real, but there is no specific workplace health and safety trigger associated with that. But in both scenarios, working from home is clearly an option for those roles that allow that to occur.
Thanks, Alex. I guess we're all starting to learn the challenges of working from home. We can hear your dog barking in the background there. So we're all having those experiences. I guess this came up before in terms of Jason flagging, conflicts and performance. And I could see one of our participants has asked about a particular situation with where they shut down their office last week. Small team now working from home offices, like many of us are doing, and they've now discovered on the Zoom call that the staff member left the state to spend time with their new partner in the ACT, but gave no advice. And it's still working from home, but don't know any context, and just feel that the lack of honesty and transparency around that is not what you'd expect from your employee. Any advice from you or maybe Belinda around this particular issue, but also how do we manage people in this new environment that we have where we can't physically see people at all times, and what do we do in terms of managing performance in this online era? Belinda?
Employee taking off for another state. I think that you have to have those, we've talked a lot about having very open and honest conversations with your staff, and probably at this point in time there's no better time to be doing it than what we have at the moment. So it's being clear, set the expectations, make it clear to your employees that they are working from home, that you have very clear expectations, set guidelines, set expectations, set indicators, set pieces of work that you want done in a period of time, so that they have very clear goals and they know exactly what they have to do during that time. So, and then obviously check in on a regular basis, be talking, which it sounds like many people are doing already, having those Zoom meetings or Skype meetings or whatever on a regular basis, We would suggest even a daily basis to ensure that people are doing what they need to be doing and are reporting back to you about what they're actually doing. In respect to that scenario of an employee who's moved to the ACT and hadn't spoken to their employer about it, look, there's nothing legally stopping them doing that, but it's more an issue of the relationship between the employer and employee and what you would expect as an employer for them to be telling you about that. So I just have that conversation with the employer and say, look, the employee, and say, look, I'm really disappointed. You should have told us that you were going to the ACT, and make it very clear to them that you are disappointed about it, and see how they respond from there.
If I can just chime in and add a little bit to Belinda, you make some excellent points. I think that from a psychological perspective, I just add that transparency is a two-way street, and it's not unreasonable to, in these really tough times where communication challenges are just much more emphasized than what they otherwise would be, that if you are making genuine efforts to be transparent and upfront and open, that you ask the same of your employees. But hand in hand with that, you also need to make sure that there's a sense of safety. We call it psychological safety, that people feel that they can be honest and that it won't bite them in the backside. And you won't just flat out reject a request to go move with their partner that they otherwise might not be able to see for 6 months, who knows how long. So being aware of how this situation echoes through the rumor mill of your organization, how you respond to it, will flag and signal to your other employees how transparent and open they can be with you about their own changes in circumstance. If you really respond adversely and people feel like, oh, I can't be honest about this stuff because I'll get my head bitten off, they may well go to a different state, and they may well just set up a teleconference call against a blank white wall and you can't tell. And then there'll be these things going on in the background that you won't have visibility of. And who knows what sort of ripple effects that will have on the efficiency of your organization and how well people are communicating. So also, yes, be very clear, set your expectations, 100% absolutely. That is the way it should be done, but also be very mindful of the flow-on effects and how that might be perceived, particularly if there's no legal obligation for people to stay in their home state.
I think that's a really good point, Jason, and particularly when there is a climate of anxiety, I guess, throughout society in terms of job security, because what we do see very often in employment scenarios is where people become so anxious about keeping their job, they start doing the wrong thing in terms of whether it's performance or behaviour, just because they get into this cycle. So I think that's a really good point. And I guess just one of the other questions is about, stay at home, parents who are required to stay at home with their children. And this is, I guess, one of the biggest challenges that politicians are facing in terms of, do we keep the economy going and keep schools open versus safety? And so people are still working, or how can people work from home if their children are there? And I think that does really, as you say, Jason, require a great deal of trust from employers to employees, but really also thinking about the concept of flexible working and how can we work together so that people can manage their personal obligations within their house, be that a dog or a child or poor internet, and that we work together with employees to get through this period together. And maybe the output isn't quite what you would normally get if they were at work, but if it's reasonable for what we can expect in the current circumstances, then that, should be recognised. I think one of the people, there's a couple of questions around what if, for whatever reason, based on performance previously, you don't trust an employee to work from home productively. To our, I guess, IR specialist, Belinda and Alex, is there a point at which you say, well, the trust is broken and I don't have to offer you that kind of work, or you must still attend the workplace, even if they think there's a risk in terms of their health and safety?
Belinda, do you want to answer that one?
Yep, okay. So, look, I think at the end of the day, it's a work situation. So if a person's not performing and a person isn't delivering what's being expected of them in a workforce scenario, then they should still be dealt with. We shouldn't stand back from that. There needs to be the conversations with them around why they are not performing, why they're not doing what you require of them. And if they still continue to do that, if they're not, giving you updates on a daily basis, if they're not completing pieces of work that you've given them, you should still deal with it as you would do if that person was back in an office situation working next to everybody else. So it's about setting those very clear requirements of what you expect of the workforce. And then if, unfortunately, there may be some employees who breach the trust and are down at the beach and aren't necessarily doing what you want them to do, and you become aware of it, it's dealing with it as a performance issue, just like you would if they was in an office.
Thanks, Belinda. And I guess to follow up from that, what obligation or what should the employer's response be if you think employees are disobeying the government's social distancing guidelines or not staying at home, or there's some other sort of breach? It may not be directly related to their work, but do you think that they're maybe breaking the laws or the social expectations that are out there at the moment? Is that the employer's responsibility at all?
I'll answer that one, Nadia.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's difficult because generally out of hours conduct not directly related to work cannot be the subject of disciplinary action in the workplace. So here I think that the connection is indirect, incidental, and therefore I think it would be hard to use that as a trigger to discipline an employee, and particularly to go through a process of termination. I think in the current environment, a reminder to all our staff, all our family, all our friends of what the expectations are around social distancing and other risk minimisation measures is important and should always be kind of stressed. But I think it would be hard to go through a formal disciplinary process at this time.
And what's the employer's responsibility in terms of workplace health and safety at home, and also in terms of providing equipment, say around like an office desk or chair, internet?
Generally, if employers facilitate work from home arrangements, they are required to ensure the workplace health and safety of their employees. So that will, in the ordinary course, necessitate home inspections to make sure that the workstation is appropriate, there's ergonomically designed chairs, there's appropriate resources, etc. There's internet connection. These are extraordinary times, and the rate at which these issues are being implemented is meaning that all those usual measures are not necessarily being followed to the T. And sometimes these arrangements are put in place subject to the employees providing home IT, providing internet access at their cost as a mechanism to keep them engaged, because the alternative for many of these employees is that they go on leave without pay, and employers are doing all they can within reason to try and avoid those eventualities and the negative financial impact that will have on the individuals.
That one organisation's had some discussions around hiring a childcare worker and starting a daycare at work, and is this something other companies are looking at? I will speak to this one, and it hasn't been something that's specifically come up in relation to COVID, but it is something that I'm aware that some employers have looked at previously, where they have a large number of employees or key people who are employees who have caring responsibilities, young children. And myself personally, when I had my son, I took my son to work 2 days a week, and our business put in place certain arrangements, including a family room where feeding could occur, expressing, and those sort of things. I'm also aware of a business in Logan in Brisbane, an accounting firm that established its own creche and provides that to both clients and to their employees to be able to do that. So it is certainly possible. It's something you need to be careful about in terms of licensing and duty of care, but it's definitely something that's worth looking into if that can mean your business can continue its continuity. If you, and this might be an issue for sort of following medical advice more than industrial advice, but if you have one member of your team that does contract COVID-19, would all staff then need to be quarantined, assuming they were in physical contact with them, I guess?
Yeah, I saw a question related to that was worker grouping. So my understanding of the medical requirements is in a workplace setting, if a person is diagnosed positively with COVID-19, then those employees that certainly had direct contact with them at the workplace would be required to self-isolate for the period of 14 days. What some organisations are doing currently to reduce the risk of entire work groups having to be removed and self-isolate in an environment where perhaps they can't work remotely is either making multidisciplinary teams, so splitting, finance with HR, commercial, etc., or what they've seen in a factory operational setting is locking down set groups on set rosters. So set 7.6 hour day, 24-minute break where cleaning occurs, next 7.6 hours afternoon, 24 minutes night shift, etc. And those shifts being self-contained. So if there is an outbreak within a work group, it will be confined to that particular shift rotation.
I guess the last thing that I was going to talk about is when we come out of this period, Alex, from an employer perspective, do you have any sort of final comments you'd like to make as to, how you go about gathering your employees together and recovering, I guess, from this situation? Alex, you're just on mute.
Sorry. At the moment, all businesses are in survival mode. And so we're just trying to get through the next week, the next month. And with the uncertainty, we're not sure how long this survival mode will take place. But the reality is that we will come out the other side and that most of the organisations that we deal with will continue to operate in some form. This sort of crisis is an opportunity to bring people together and to create uniformity of purpose and vision. At the moment, that all seems too hard, but there will be some positives to come out of it. And as people start to return to the workforce, there will be a period of time of elation that things are returning back to normal, and that provides an opportunity to reset organisational goals, reset structures when we have a lot of positivity. So within organisations, when we look to restructure, we look to change, often there is resistance from within, from those people that want to maintain the status quo. I think it's fair to say that no one anywhere in Australia at the moment wants to maintain the status quo. So when we come back together, there is an opportunity to re-image, reimagine, restructure the organisation in the way that we want it, in a way that it will be stronger, in the way that it will thrive into the future rather than survive in the short term.
That's good advice, Alex. I think the other thing I know Jason would say from a psychological perspective is that it is going to be something that causes us all grief in its greatest term, and that we all know from being through, friends, family, ourselves, through periods of grief, loss of loved ones. We go through a cycle, and it's very often the months and years after the trauma has occurred that people are still recovering and have the most impact to their lives. So I think the wellness issues will not cease once we get past this period, that employers will continue to need to look at the wellness of their leaders and their people in terms of how they deal with this trauma our society has been through. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today and for the many questions. I'm sorry if we haven't been able to respond to every question, but as mentioned, you will receive 2 FAQs, which will deal with this, and some information about how you can get further advice. On that note, I just want to hand back to Rob Douglas from Australian Owner Manager.
Thanks, Nadia. Alex, Belinda, Jason, what a fantastic session, and great to see the discussion that's coming through in terms of question and answer and chat. And then, as Nadia said, it's a shame that we can't answer everyone's questions, but there will be an FAQ that comes out. And look, you know, you're welcome to get in touch with a specialist if, you know, there's a specific need that you have in terms of your particular organisation. So in terms of this series, this webinar obviously is about to conclude. We have another one tomorrow that is around the government stimulus package and what you can avail yourself of there. And then there's another one on Friday as well, which is more about your personal well-being and so forth. So if you can join us, we look forward to seeing you. But for us today, thanks very much, and have a wonderful rest of the day. And thanks, Mapien team.